Welcome back. This is segment 6 in this series. And in the last segment I promised that this time we will be talking about the rapture. Now back in 1 Thessalonians, Paul promised that those newly awakened and resurrected believers who have recognized the coming as what was referred to in the last presentation as the coming of the bridegroom, that these who have awakened and risen from the dead will then be, quote, caught up together to a meeting with the Lord in the air, and so we will always be with the Lord. In the original Greek, the word caught up is harpesh. Harpesh. Remember that. That's going to be brought up again here in the very near future. Now this is the passage that has given birth to the modern Christian dogma of the rapture. Now, most of us have seen bumper stickers on cars which read, "Warning, in case of rapture, this car will be vacant." Now, there actually are some fleshly-minded people who literally believe that they will physically disappear from their cars and that there will be accidents because these cars will no longer have drivers behind the wheel. Now, is this what Paul meant when he spoke of being caught up? Now, back in the section that I did on ascension, Paul told us that Jesus ascended into heaven to prepare a place for his faithful followers. Ask yourself, was this ascension a preparation for a fleshly rapture? Will the believers actually be literally, physically caught up into the air to always be with the Lord in heaven? Now there are similar statements in the New Testament which help us to understand what Paul meant when he wrote of being caught up to a meeting with the Lord in the air. For example, there actually was a time when Paul was an enemy of Christ, and when Paul actively persecuted the Christian community. Now, like the foolish virgins of Jesus' parable, Paul couldn't see that the bridegroom had already come. But when he woke up, and when Paul saw that Jesus truly was the Messiah, he was then resurrected from the death of unbelief. Now, Paul describes this experience in his writings. He says that when he recognized Jesus, he too was, quote, caught up as far as the third heaven, and heard words so secret that human lips may not repeat them. 2 Corinthians 12:1. Paul too was caught up or raptured into heaven 2,000 years ago. Now, once again, the word that has been translated here, caught up, comes from the original Greek, harpezo. It's the same word that he uses in the Thessalonians statement. Now, was Paul telling us that he physically ascended into heaven while he was still alive 2,000 years ago? Ask yourself, can flesh and blood enter heaven? If we choose to believe what Paul told us in 1 Corinthians 15, the answer is an emphatic no. Flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God. Now, in another place, the Apostle John similarly claimed that he too ascended into heaven while he still was alive. John wrote, quote, "After this I looked, and there before me was a door standing open in heaven, and the voice said, 'Come up here, and I show you what must take place after this.' At once I was in the Spirit, and there before me was a throne in heaven." This is in the Revelation of John 4:1. The voice said, "Come up to heaven." Now later in the same book, John explains that he did not ascend into heaven with his physical body. Instead, he says that he saw these things, quote, in my vision. It's in Revelation 9:17. John's ascent into heaven was not a fleshly reality. It too was, quote, in the Spirit. Now, another example of someone who was, quote, translated, unquote, into heaven is the story of the Old Testament prophet Enoch. Now, in the book of Hebrews, we can read that, quote, by faith Enoch was translated so as to not see death, and was not found because God had translated him. For before his translation he had obtained witness to have been pleasing. But without faith it is impossible to please God. This is in Hebrews 11:5 and 6. Now in other places Paul wrote that it is only possible to please God when, quote, we have the mind of the Spirit. When we, quote, spiritually discern the, quote, word of truth. And when we live the, quote, the true faith. Now we also know from Paul's other teachings that he was not telling us that Enoch had been physically carried away into heaven. In his letter to the Colossians, Paul clearly explains what is meant by being translated or being caught up into the kingdom of God. Paul wrote, quote, we do not cease praying for you and asking that you may be filled with the knowledge of his will in all wisdom and spiritual understanding, giving thanks to the Father who delivered us out of the power of darkness and translated us into the kingdom of the Son, who is the image of the invisible God. Colossians 1:9-14. Now the word translated here is metastasin, carried away into the kingdom of the Son. According to Paul, when we combine, quote, knowledge of his will with, quote, spiritual understanding, only then is it possible to be translated out of the spiritual darkness into the light of the kingdom of the Son. Once again, this is a spiritual reality, which has nothing to do with physical bodies. Remember, Paul wrote in hidden mysteries. This is Paul's interpretation of the rapture, and this is his explanation of how people can be, quote, translated into the invisible spiritual realm of God. Now both Jesus and Paul warned that Christians will fall away from the true faith by the time that Christ returns. Now how can we tell who has been, quote, led astray? And how can we tell who needs to wake up and to rise from the spiritually dead? Paul said that Christians will be judged, quote, according to my gospel, unquote. And he charged each and every one of us to, quote, stand firm and hold fast to the traditions and instructions which you were taught by us, whether by our word of mouth or by letter. 2 Thessalonians 2. Paul also challenged us, quote, do you still hold fast the gospel as I preached it to you? If not, your conversion was in vain. Unquote. And Paul advised us to, quote, examine yourselves to see whether you are in the faith. Test yourselves. That's in 2 Corinthians 13:5. Now, if we measure modern Christians by the authoritative standard established in Peter and Paul's writings, what do we find? Have Christians remained faithful to this standard? Or have they fallen away from Peter and Paul's teachings? Have they been more like the true and loyal servant? Or have they been like the wicked servant who abused his master's trust? Now, Peter and Paul both taught that the fundamental doctrines of Christianity, which include resurrection, rebirth, ascension, and coming down from heaven, they taught that these all have inner symbolic spiritual realities. They never intended for these teachings to be interpreted in a literal fleshly way. Now this is the firm foundation upon which the church should have been built. And this is the authoritative standard of what was called the true faith, by which Christians will be measured and judged. Now Paul said that he spoke, quote, expressing spiritual truths and spiritual words, and that his teachings need to be spiritually discerned or spiritually interpreted. We find, however, that most modern Christians have chosen to interpret the Christian teachings literally. Now, Peter and Paul taught that Christ died, quote, in the flesh and was raised, quote, in the spirit. And most modern Christians have rejected this teaching and instead believe that Jesus rose literally in the flesh. Now, Paul taught that flesh and blood cannot inherit the invisible spiritual realm of God. Most modern Christians believe that Jesus literally ascended into heaven with his fleshly body. Now, obviously, there are some significant discrepancies between what most Christians believe today and what Peter and Paul originally taught. Now, when we do what the apostles advise us to do, when we measure modern Christians by their writings, it seems that most believe the exact opposite of what Peter and Paul taught. Is this what Jesus and Paul meant when they warned about Christians being led astray, or about Christians falling away? Is this what Jesus meant when he said that even the elect of Christianity will be deceived by false prophets? Is this what Peter meant when he wrote that false teachers will import disastrous heresies, which will cause Christians to abandon the straight road? Now, Jesus tells us that only those who have remained faithful will be rewarded, while those who have been foolish will be punished and sent away. Or perhaps in another sense, they will deprive themselves. Now, at the end of the 24th chapter of Matthew, Jesus relates another parable. And remember that the 24th chapter of Matthew is the one where Jesus was asked, when will be the sign of thy coming, the parousia, the return of your presence, and the end of this age? He ends his commentary in the 24th chapter of Matthew by telling a parable, this time about two servants. Now, the first servant is, quote, faithful and wise, unquote, because while the master is away, he loyally feeds and cares for the master's children. Now, the other servant is described as, quote, wicked, because he gets drunk, neglects his duties, and abuses, quote, his fellow servants, unquote. Now, as a result, Jesus says that when the master returns, the faithful and wise servant will be rewarded, while the wicked servant will be beaten and sent away. Apparently, Jesus was warning that at the time of his return, there will be great confusion and tribulation characterized by a widespread falling away from the truth. And Jesus declared that only, quote, he who endures to the end shall be saved. Only he who endures to the end shall be saved. Only he who endures to the end shall have salvation. Matthew 24:13. Why is this important? Does it really matter? Look at history. Learn the lessons of history. 2,000 years ago, the Jews had fallen away from the true interpretation of their teachings. Their blindness eventually resulted in the deaths of John the Baptist, Jesus, Peter and Paul, and all of the other apostles. Their blindness also led to the disintegration of the Jewish nation and to the death and dispersion of thousands of Jews. Obviously, this is very important, and it does matter very much. The stakes of this game are extremely high. Now, if modern Christians find that they have been led astray, then they need to do something about it. They need to get back on the hodos, the path, the way, the true path. And if they find that they have fallen away, then they need to come back to what Paul called the true faith. If Christians today hope to be spiritually prepared and alert enough to avoid repeating the exact same mistakes that the Jews made 2,000 years ago, then according to the apostles, they need to wake up, to rise from the dead, to be reborn, and to open their eyes. They need to return to the original authoritative Christian teachings. And maybe then they will be able to recognize the promised one when he comes. Now this brings us to the most exciting and possibly the most important part of Paul's statement from 1 Thessalonians. Paul next promises that, quote, the Lord himself shall come down from heaven. Now once again, most Christians today interpret this passage literally. They actually expect the physical, fleshly return of Christ from heaven. Now is this what Paul was trying to tell us when he was writing this passage? Ask yourself again, what happened in the past? How did the other prophets of God come down from heaven? As we've already seen at the beginning of this presentation, Jesus' explanation of how Elijah returned from heaven was in spirit. And then in the 6th chapter of the Gospel of John, Jesus gives us another example of how a prophet comes down from heaven. Here the, quote, Lord Jesus, in Thessalonians Paul said that the Lord is going to come down from heaven. And in the 6th chapter of John, the Lord Jesus explains that he personally came down from heaven the first time that he appeared, 2,000 years ago. And that he not only was rejected by his enemies, but he was also rejected by his own beloved disciples. Jesus said here, quote, I have come down from heaven. At this the Jews began to grumble about him. They said, is this not Jesus, the son of Joseph, whose father and mother we know? How can he now say, I have come down from heaven? And he continues, on hearing it, many of Jesus' disciples said, this is a hard teaching. Who can accept it? From this time, many of his disciples turned back and no longer followed him. John, this is in the 6th chapter of John. Now, many people are not aware of the fact that Jesus not only had 12 apostles, but he also had either 70 or 72 disciples, depending on which early manuscript you accept. Now, can you imagine the sadness that Jesus must have felt as he saw his beloved disciples leaving him, never to return? When Jesus said, I came down from heaven, both the hostile Jewish religious leaders and Jesus' own disciples rejected this statement because they thought that he was speaking literally, and they knew that this was impossible. They didn't have the insight to see what Jesus was really saying here. Jesus truly had come down from heaven, but like Elijah's return, quote, from heaven, this event had nothing to do with his physical body. Now, as Jesus stood there watching his disciples walk away, knowing that they were not going to come back, he explained what he meant when he said that he had come down from heaven. Jesus said, quote, "The Spirit gives life. The flesh counts for nothing. The words that I have spoken to you are spirit, and they are life." So Jesus is saying, when he said, "I came down from heaven," he was talking about the Spirit here, not the flesh. Obviously, Jesus was born as a child. The rabbi said, "We knew your mother, we knew your father. How can you say, 'I have come down from heaven'?" And here Jesus is telling us that he was talking not about flesh, but about spirit. Jesus was trying to help us see that his words should not be understood only in their outer literal sense, but that they should be perceived in terms of their hidden inner spiritual meanings. God's principle governing how a prophet returns from heaven has been clearly demonstrated twice. Elijah returned from heaven as John the Baptist. Jesus came down the first time he appeared 2,000 years ago, but it was in the Spirit. This was not the way that most people were expecting these things to be fulfilled. When Jesus and Elijah came down from heaven, it was not literally in the flesh. Instead, they came spiritually, as the Gospel says, in spirit and power. Now, if we look again at the Old Testament prophecy where Malachi foretold the return of Elijah, quote, from heaven, we can see that God gives us another promise. Speaking through Malachi, God says, quote, "I, the Lord, do not change." This is in Malachi 3:6. Now, a similar statement can also be found in the writings of the Apostle James, who wrote, quote, "Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows." God does not change. James 1:17. God does not change like shifting shadows. His ways do not change. Now look at science. Look at nature. Have the laws of physics or the principles of mathematics ever changed? Of course not. God doesn't change. Now the people who lived in Bible times had the same physical laws that we have today. And similarly, the people of our time live under the same eternal spiritual laws that people had back then, 2,000-3,000 years ago. None of these principles have changed, and neither has God. For example, another example of God's unchangeability can be seen in the way that God sends prophets into the world. God has been sending prophets to humanity for thousands of years. They have always appeared in the way described by Isaiah, quote, "Unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given." That's Isaiah 9:6. God's prophets were all born into the world as children. Not one has ever literally come down from heaven in the flesh. Now there is an important lesson to be learned from these examples. If this is how these promises were fulfilled in the past, then is there any reason to believe that God has changed his ways since then? If these prophecies were all fulfilled spiritually in Jesus' day, then is there any reason to assume that they won't be fulfilled the same way now? Now, sadly enough, there are people today who ignore these explanations from the apostles and who choose to interpret these statements literally. They actually expect to see Christ physically descend from heaven in the flesh. Now can you begin to see why Paul repeatedly called us ignorant? Jesus explained that his second coming will be just as difficult to recognize as Elijah's and his own first coming down from heaven was 2,000 years ago. Now, referring to the time of his second coming, Jesus said that, quote, "No one knows when the Son of Man will come." Matthew 24:36. And Jesus said that his coming will be at an hour when you do not expect. Matthew 24:44. And that when he does come, Jesus said that it will be like a thief in the night, who breaks into the house and is gone before anyone even realizes that he had been there. This is Jesus' explanation of thief in the night in Matthew 24:43. The thief breaks into your house and is gone before anyone even realizes that he had been there. In the past, the other prophets also came as a thief in the night. They were not recognized, they were not accepted. And we as members of the Baha'i faith would lovingly, carefully, cautiously, respectfully ask Christians to begin to investigate the possibility that their prophecies concerning the return of Christ have already been fulfilled. Obviously, the more obvious signs of the appearance of the Messianic age have already come into being. In the Old Testament it says, in this day, the day of the coming of the Son of Man, or the coming of the Promised One, it says that knowledge will be greatly increased. Ask yourself, has this already happened? Of course, the answer is yes. Knowledge since the middle of the 1800s has increased dramatically, spectacularly. Life in this period of time, in the last 150 years, is totally different than it was 2,000 years ago. In other places, in the Old Testament prophecies and in the prophecies of Jesus, it says that the Messiah will appear and he will gather the Jews back to him, that the Jews will return to Israel. Now, look at the nation of Israel today. This prophecy too has been fulfilled. So, and these are just some of the more obvious prophecies. The Baha'is would explain to Christians very carefully and lovingly, and with the most respect and humility, that the one whose coming they have been waiting to see has come. That his name is Baha'u'llah, and that Baha'u'llah claims in the most explicit language that he is the one whose coming was foretold in the Christian prophecies. Now, Baha'u'llah, the founder of the Baha'i faith, is the great teacher whose coming was foretold in the prophecies. He fulfills prophecies from all of the world's holy books, from all of the world's great religions. Baha'u'llah is the promised one, and the promised day of the unity of humanity and the peace of humanity as foretold in the holy books has begun to dawn. Baha'u'llah proclaimed, quote, "The time foreordained unto the peoples and kindreds of the earth is now come. The promises of God, as recorded in the Holy Scriptures, have all been fulfilled." Baha'u'llah also wrote, "Verily I say, this is the day in which mankind can behold the face and hear the voice of the Promised One. The call of God hath been raised, and the light of his countenance hath been lifted up upon men. It behoveth every man to blot out the trace of every idle word from the tablet of his heart, and to gaze with an open and unbiased mind on the signs of his revelation, the proofs of his mission, and the tokens of his glory. Now to the followers of Christ, Baha'u'llah wrote, If ye be intent on crucifying once again Jesus the Spirit of God, put me to death, for he hath once more in my person been made manifest unto you." Unquote. Now Baha'u'llah fulfills more prophecies than Abraham, Moses, Jesus, Muhammad, and all the other prophets combined. The promised one has come, and this can clearly be established. Baha'u'llah's coming has been clearly foretold in the prophecies of the Bible. And this is what we are going to be beginning to discuss next. Now, the Messianic prophecies found in the Bible are some of the most fascinating and controversial topics in all of the Bible. Many of these prophecies are stated in such highly symbolic language that it's difficult to understand what they are saying. Nevertheless, there is a way that these prophecies can be deciphered. Now, for those who don't know this, it's a fascinating fact that the four major religions of the Middle East, namely the Jewish, Zoroastrian, Christian, and Islamic religions, that all of these Middle Eastern religions have messianic prophecies. And what's fascinating is when these prophecies are compared side by side, they show remarkable similarities to each other. In fact, they all seem to be foretelling the exact same event. Now, ask yourself, is there an organic link between these religions? Are they related to each other? Are they truly all sent by the one same God? Now, you may be pleasantly surprised at what these prophecies reveal. Now, as I said, the prophecies can be very difficult to understand. And I've found that one of the easiest ways to decipher what they are saying is to look at the numbers that the prophecies contain. Many of the prophecies contain numbers such as 70 weeks, 2,300 days, 7 years, 42 months, 3.5 years, 1,260 days. Now, these numbers are extremely important. In fact, they are the keys which unlock the hidden meanings of the prophecies. Now, what does it take to break the code of the numbers? How can they help us to understand what the prophecies are saying? Fortunately, the Baha'i writings offer some remarkable insights which can help us to completely understand what the prophecies and the numbers are saying. Now, before we can begin to unravel the secrets of the numbers, we need to first establish a couple of important principles. Our first code-breaking principle comes from the book of Ezekiel, where it says, "Thou shalt bear the iniquity of the house of Judah 40 days. Now listen to this. "I have appointed thee each day for a year." That's in Ezekiel 4:6. Each day for a year. Can you see what this passage is saying? Days in prophecy can actually be years. So when this prophecy says 40 days, it actually can mean 40 years. Days and years are interchangeable in prophecy. Now, this principle is again restated in the Old Testament book of Numbers, where it says, quote, "After the number of days in which you search the land, even 40 days, each day for a year, shall you bear your iniquities, even 40 years. Numbers 14:34. Once again, it says each day for a year. And this is an important code-breaking principle. This is one of the keys. Days can equal years in prophecy. Now, keeping this principle in mind, let's begin to examine the prophetic numbers. Now, the first prophecy that I'd like to have you take a look at is the 70-week prophecy found in the book of Daniel. Now, this prophecy is important because it already has been fulfilled, and because it foretold a well-known, historically verifiable event. As a result, it offers us an excellent opportunity to test our code-breaking procedure in a situation where we already know the answer. Now, this 70-week prophecy can be found in the Old Testament book of Daniel, chapter 9, verses 24 to 27. Now, here we are told that, quote, 70 weeks are determined from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem, then shall Messiah be cut off. This is kind of an edited version of the prophecy, but this is what it says. In other words, this prophecy foretold a time when the Messiah shall be, quote, cut off. This prophecy foretold the death of Jesus. Now, the Baha'i writings tell us that this commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem was given by a Persian king named Artaxerxes. The story behind this is that 600 and some years before Christ appeared, Israel had been conquered by a foreign army. The city of Jerusalem was partially destroyed, and those Jews who survived were taken captive into Babylon. Now, decades later, the Persians conquered the Babylonian Empire, and the Jewish slaves who were being held captive in Babylon became the property of the Persian Empire. Now, it was at this time that the Hebrew patriarch Nehemiah had become the personal servant of Artaxerxes, the king of Persia. And it was partially because of their friendship, and for other reasons, that Artaxerxes the king was persuaded to allow Nehemiah to return to Israel so that he could rebuild the city of Jerusalem. Now, the Bible accounts actually list 4 separate decrees to rebuild Jerusalem, which were given over a period of time by 3 different Persian kings. However, the 3rd decree was the only one which actually resulted in the rebuilding of the city. Now, according to the Baha'i writings, this decree was given in 457 BC by Artaxerxes, the Persian king. Now, I'm trying to develop the background of the prophecy of Daniel. So, the decree to restore and to rebuild Jerusalem, according to this, was given in the year 457 BC by the Persian king. Now, Daniel tells us that, quote, 70 weeks are determined from this date, when Artaxerxes' decree to rebuild Jerusalem was given, until the time when the Messiah shall be cut off. Now, the number 70 weeks is the key to understanding the prophecy. Try to visualize this. Now, remembering Ezekiel's code-breaking principle, we know that days can equal years in prophecy. So let's begin unraveling this prophecy by calculating the number of days that there are in 70 weeks. So if we multiply 70 weeks times 7 days in a week, we get 490 days. There are 490 days in 70 weeks. Now, using the day for a year principle, this means that our 490 days can actually mean 490 years. So let's then review Daniel's prophecy again and begin to apply this new information. Daniel told us that 70 weeks, or as we now know, 490 years, are determined from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem, which we now know was given in 457 BC. The commandment to restore and build Jerusalem was given in 457 BC. And then Daniel says, then shall Messiah be cut off. So if we start at 457 BC and count forward 490 years, we arrive at the year 33-34 of the Christian era. According to Daniel, this is the time when the Messiah shall be, quote, cut off. Now, only one person who claimed to be the Messiah was cut off about 34 AD. This prophecy clearly shows that Daniel specifically predicted the death of Jesus centuries before it happened. And this is the secret of the 70-week prophecy. Now, this calculation tells us several things. We know that the prophecies from the book of Daniel are both authentic and accurate. We know that Daniel identified Jesus as the Messiah hundreds of years before he was even born. And possibly most importantly, at least for the sake of this presentation, we know that our day for a year code-breaking principle works. So we've passed the first test. Next, let's see how these principles work when applied to the other prophetic numbers. Now, the prophecy from the book of Daniel actually has two parts. As we have already shown, the first part, the 70-week, 490-year prophecy, foretells the first coming of Christ and his sacrificial death. The second part involves a companion number to the 70-week prophecy, this time the number 2300 days. Now, this number is also extremely important since it conceals the secret of the time of Jesus' second coming. Now, back in the 24th chapter of Matthew, when Jesus' apostles asked him, "When shall these things be, and when shall be the sign of thy coming?" Jesus answered, When ye shall therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place." This is in Matthew 24. Now, this abomination of desolation passage referred to by Jesus is found in the book of Daniel, just a few verses before the 70-week prophecy. Now, Daniel's abomination of desolation prophecy reads, quote, pay attention here, "How long shall be the transgression of desolation, to give both the sanctuary and the host to be trodden under foot? And he said unto me, under 2,300 days." Daniel 8:13 and 14. Now, the number 2300 days is the key to understanding the apostles of Jesus' question, "When shall these things be? When will you return?" Now, we know from Ezekiel's day-for-year principle that 2300 days can actually be 2300 years. In other words, this prophecy is telling us that Christ will appear after a 2300-year period of time. Now, if we can determine when this prophecy was supposed to begin, then we will know when Christ is due to return. Now, the Baha'i writings advise us to use the same starting date of 457 BC that we used in the 70-week calculation. So when we count forward 2300 years from 457 BC, we arrive at the year 1844 of the Christian era. Now, 1844 is the same exact year that several Adventist Christian groups pinpointed as the time of Christ's return. Now, is this truly the year that the 2300 days prophecy foretold? Did anything important happen in 1844? The significance of this year will soon become more apparent. I'm running out of time today, but I wanted to emphasize that so far in this presentation, we have proven that recognizing prophets of God when they come is not as easy as many people think that it might be. Many Christians today are waiting for the literal physical descent of Jesus from heaven. This is never how the prophecies were fulfilled in the past. This is never how prophets of God returned from heaven in the past. The prophets of God have always been born as children. As Isaiah said, "Unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given." This is how the prophets have always appeared in the past. Now, in this last section where we're beginning to look at the numbers of the prophecies, we can begin to see that there are ways to understand the prophecies. That the 70-week prophecy of Daniel foretold the coming of Jesus. And that Jesus' explanation of the 2300-day prophecy, the abomination of desolation prophecy of Daniel, foretells the time of his second coming. Now, the year 1844 was the year when the Baha'i faith began. And the Baha'i faith very clearly claims to be the fulfillment of the Christian prophecies. Now, I have run out of time in this segment.